Welcome back to Diplomacy and International Relations by Bastian Freiburg. You know how this works. It's AI generated, but Bastian has checked everything we're talking about just to be sure.
Always good to have that safety net.
Right. So last time we were really digging into diplomacy in general, but now we're zeroing in on Denmark.
Yeah, getting a little more specific this time.
Exactly. Should be interesting to see how this, relatively small country is punching above its weight on the global stage these days.
Absolutely. And also how their diplomacy is evolving and adapting in a world that's, well,
A little bit crazy.
you could say that, yeah, definitely anything but predictable.
Okay, so let's start with the big picture. I mean, the world of diplomacy has changed so much just in the last few decades, right?
It really has. It's pretty remarkable when you think about it.
It is. It's like a whole new game out there.
Yeah, the old strategies, those old playbooks from the Cold War era, they just don't cut it anymore.
Makes sense. I mean, back then it was all about what, total war, European integration, and this very specific view of globalization.
Yeah, exactly. And that was kind of the driving force behind everything.
But now it's a whole different ballgame.
Totally. So, how do you think all of this has impacted Denmark specifically?
Well, I know for a long time Denmark's strategy was to basically be the Lodsfisk. Did I say that right?
You got it. That's pilot fish in English.
Right, pilot fish. So the idea was what, to swim alongside the bigger fish for protection.
Exactly, like sticking close to the U.S. for security, kind of relying on those bigger powers.
Classic pilot fish strategy.
Exactly, but what's interesting is the sources we're looking at, they're suggesting that this strategy might not be as viable as it once was.
Interesting. So if Denmark is not just hitching a ride on the shark anymore, what's changed? I mean, what's next for them?
Well, that's where things get really fascinating, because it looks like Denmark is actually becoming a kind of unexpected role model on the global stage.
Their whole model.
Yeah. Especially when it comes to things like, social capital, economic stability, effective governance, all that.
So all those things that everyone's always striving for.
Exactly. Environmental sustainability, social equality, you name it.
Wow, hold on. Are you saying that other countries are actually looking to Denmark for inspiration?
It seems that way. And, when you think about it, it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, they do seem to be doing a lot of things right, especially compared to some bigger, more powerful countries.
Right. Like their welfare system, it's amazing. A lot of people point to it as a model. Their green energy initiatives are really groundbreaking.
Yeah, and they always rank super high in those global happiness surveys, right?
They do. And I think all of that, it really gives Danish diplomats a leg up.
Like a secret weapon almost.
Kind of, yeah, because they're not just representing a country, they're representing, like, a success story.
They can say, hey, we figured some things out over here. Maybe you can learn a thing or two.
Exactly. I mean, what do you think?
I think it's a pretty powerful position to be in, that's for sure. But how has this shift impacted the diplomats themselves? Are we still talking about those stereotypical reserved figures operating behind the scenes?
Oh, it's definitely not your grandfather's diplomacy anymore.
Yeah. So less champagne and caviar, more, I don't know, rolling up your sleeves and getting things done.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. There's definitely been a mindset shift. It's less about that traditional focus on high-level politics and national sovereignty,
And more about,
more about a hands-on problem-solving approach.
so less smoking jackets and more boiler suits.
Exactly.
Okay, I like that image.
And this new generation, they're really engaging in what's called economic diplomacy,
Which basically means.
actively promoting Danish businesses and interests abroad.
Oh, so it's kind of like they're salespeople for Denmark in a way.
In a way, yeah, they're definitely out there showcasing what Denmark has to offer.
Interesting.
And they're also super involved in public diplomacy.
So building relationships with everyday people.
Exactly. And presenting a positive image of Denmark to the world, really trying to connect with people on a personal level.
Wow, that's a pretty big departure from that traditional image of a diplomat, isn't it?
It is, but it makes sense. I mean, in today's world, diplomacy, it's not just about government-to-government relations anymore. It's about building bridges between people.
It's about showing the world what makes your country unique and why people should care.
Exactly.
This boiler suit diplomacy, it really is shaking things up.
It is.
But how does Denmark reconcile this new, I guess you could say, bolder approach with its traditional alliances?
Good question.
Especially, its close ties to the U.S.?
Right, because Denmark still really values its opkobling strategy. It
Opkobling.
means connection in Danish, basically maintaining strong connections with key allies like the U.S.
Right, makes sense.
And it's still deeply committed to in-binding.
Okay, another Danish word.
I know, bear with me.
I'm all ears.
In-binding means integration, so basically being a member of all those international organizations.
So they're trying to juggle these long-standing partnerships with this new, more proactive approach to diplomacy.
Yeah, exactly, and it's a delicate balancing act for sure.
I bet. Do you think there's a potential for conflict there?
There's definitely some tension, and it's something we're going to explore further in this deep dive because the sources we're looking at, they seem to point towards a growing interest in something called unilateral diplomacy.
Unilateral diplomacy, so like going it alone.
Well, at least some of the time.
Wow, that seems like a pretty big shift for a country that's, traditionally relied so heavily on its alliances.
It is, but it's a trend we're seeing not just in Denmark, but in other small countries as well.
Really?
Yeah, and I think it's a recognition that, in today's world, smaller nations actually have more opportunities to make their voices heard, even if they're acting independently.
Hmm, that's interesting.
It's like they're realizing that they don't always have to wait for permission from the bigger players to take action.
It is kind of exciting in a way, right?
Definitely.
We've gone from the pilot fish clinging to the shark to, well, maybe something else entirely.
Right, like Denmark as a potential role model,
Sure.
charting its own course.
Yeah, forging its own path, and maybe even inspiring others along the way.
Exactly. I mean, it's a pretty bold vision, but
But the sources suggest it might actually be within reach.
they do. And that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, who knows what the future holds for Danish diplomacy, but one thing's for sure,
What's that?
it's definitely not going to be boring.
You can say that again.
So, where do we go from here?
Well, I think the next step is to really dig into this idea of Denmark as a role model.
Okay, so what makes them so special?
Right. And how does that translate into actual diplomatic strategies?
Sounds like a plan.
Let's get to it. And it's that shift, from pilot fish to potential role model. That's what's really fueling this idea of a new golden age for Danish diplomacy.
A new golden age, huh? That's a pretty bold statement.
It is, but the sources we're looking at, they really do paint a picture of a country that's punching above its weight, diplomatically speaking, at least.
They do. So what do you think is driving that? I mean, what sets Danish diplomacy apart in this new era?
Well, I think one key element is how well they've adapted to globalization.
That's interesting because usually you hear people complaining about how globalization is, homogenizing cultures, eroding national sovereignty, all.
Yeah, it gets a lot of bad press.
It does. So how has Denmark managed to not just survive, but actually thrive in this environment?
Well, I think it comes down to the fact that they're not just passively reacting to these global trends, they're actively trying to shape them.
So they're not just going with the flow. They're actually trying to make their own waves.
Exactly. And they're really good at leveraging their strengths to carve out a unique space for themselves on the world stage.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Take their approach to free trade. They've really become a leader in promoting open markets. But at the same time, they're also really committed to upholding high labor and environmental standards.
So they're finding a way to balance economic competitiveness with social responsibility.
Yeah, which is something that a lot of countries are still struggling with.
For sure. It's like they're proving that you don't have to choose between, profits and principles.
Exactly. It's not about retreating from the world or clinging to these outdated approaches.
It's about engaging with the world on your own terms.
Right, and using your unique strengths to try to influence the global agenda.
Okay, so this brings us back to unilateral diplomacy, which seemed like a pretty radical idea at first. But now I'm starting to see how it fits into this bigger picture of a Denmark that's, confident, proactive, willing to kind of forge its own path.
It's not about isolationism, it's about what they call strategic autonomy.
Which means,
It means being able to choose when to partner with others and when to pursue your own interests independently.
even if it means ruffling some feathers along the way.
Exactly.
But doesn't that risk alienating Denmark's allies?
Mm.
Especially the U.S. I mean, that relationship has been so important for them.
It's definitely a balancing act, but I think the fact that Denmark has such a strong track record, they're known for being reliable and effective, it gives them more leeway to pursue these independent initiatives.
So it's like their reputation actually gives them more freedom to act.
I think so because they've proven that they can be trusted to do the right thing, even if it means occasionally disagreeing with their allies.
Interesting. So it's almost like their willingness to take a stand,
Yeah.
to act on their principles, it actually enhances their credibility.
Yeah, and it makes them more influential in the long run.
Makes sense. So how does this all translate into concrete action? What are some examples of this boiler suit diplomacy in practice?
Well, one area where they've really made a name for themselves is in green energy and sustainability.
Right, they're like the poster child for renewable energy.
Pretty much, they've not only become a global leader in wind energy technology and sustainable urban development,
They're actually walking the walk.
they are, and they're using their diplomatic network to share their knowledge and expertise with other countries.
So they're not just preaching about climate change, they're actually helping other countries to, go green.
Exactly. And it's not just about developed countries either. They're working with developing nations to help them transition to cleaner energy sources, build more sustainable infrastructure, all that.
It's like a win-win situation.
It is. Denmark gets to showcase their expertise, promote their values.
And their partners get access to, cutting-edge technology and support for sustainable development.
Exactly. And of course, it's not purely altruistic. It also creates new markets for Danish businesses.
Right, so it's a smart strategy, both ethically and economically.
Exactly.
It seems like this new era of Danish diplomacy is really about, moving beyond those old paradigms of power and influence and embracing a more collaborative, solutions-oriented approach.
I think that's a great way to put it.
But let's be realistic. I mean, not every diplomatic initiative is going to be a home run, right?
Of course not.
There are going to be setbacks. There are going to be challenges.
Definitely no country has a perfect track record, and Denmark's no exception.
So what are some of the potential pitfalls they might face as they, navigate this new landscape?
Well, I think one challenge is managing expectations.
How so?
Well, just because Denmark has achieved success in certain areas doesn't mean that they can single-handedly solve every global problem.
Right. Ambition is great, but you also need a healthy dose of realism.
Exactly. And diplomacy is often a long game. It requires patience, persistence, a willingness to compromise.
For sure.
And I think another potential challenge is maintaining that balance between, op-cobbling and in-binding on one hand, and this pursuit of unilateral diplomacy on the other.
So how do they assert their independence without alienating their allies or undermining their commitment to multilateral institutions?
It's a tough question. Yeah, it's a tough one. It's all about picking the right tool for the job, I guess.
So sometimes going it alone makes sense, sometimes it doesn't.
Exactly. Denmark has to really weigh the benefits and the risks of each approach.
So strategic thinking, adaptability, knowing when to collaborate, knowing when to take the lead.
Yeah, and recognizing that diplomacy, it's not static, it's constantly evolving.
Always changing.
Yeah, adapting to new challenges and opportunities.
So to really understand how Denmark's putting all of this into action, we need to look at some concrete examples.
Right.
I'm all ears. What are some of the most, compelling cases where we can really see this new Danish diplomacy at work?
Well, the sources point to their engagement with China as a particularly interesting case study.
China, that's a big one.
It is. It's a complex relationship for sure.
Full of potential, but also, a lot of challenges.
Definitely. I mean, China is such a dominant force on the world stage these days.
Economically, politically, you name it.
And of course, their human rights record is a constant source of controversy.
It is. So how does Denmark approach this, this delicate balancing act?
Well, they've adopted what they call a strategy of constructive engagement.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
It means that they recognize the importance of having strong economic ties with China.
Right. I mean, China's a major trading partner for a lot of countries.
Including Denmark, but at the same time, they're not afraid to speak up about human rights and democratic values.
So they're not shying away from the tough conversations.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that diplomacy, it's not always about, these big, dramatic breakthroughs.
Sometimes it's about the small steps.
Exactly. The quiet, persistent efforts to build relationships, foster dialogue, try to nudge things in a more positive direction.
It's a long game.
It is, but the sources suggest that it's actually having an impact.
Really?
Yeah, for example, Denmark has been really instrumental in promoting green technology and sustainable development in China.
Wow, that's huge.
It is, and it's a significant step forward in addressing climate change,
It shows that even a small country can make a difference on these big global issues.
especially when they leverage their expertise and their values strategically.
So it's not just about size, it's about using what you have effectively. Okay, so another important aspect of Denmark's diplomatic strategy is their focus on multilateralism, particularly within the European Union.
Right, which makes sense. The EU gives them a platform to amplify their voice, coordinate their efforts with like-minded partners.
But does this emphasis on multilateralism ever clash with their interest in unilateral diplomacy?
It definitely can be a challenge. Denmark has to constantly balance its national interests with its commitments to the EU.
I bet. So how do they manage to strike that balance?
Well, I think it comes down to being strategic and selective. They understand that not every issue requires a united EU front.
So sometimes it makes sense for Denmark to take the lead.
Exactly, to push for a particular policy or initiative, even if it means going ahead without the full backing of all the EU member states.
That's a bold move.
It is, but it
Yeah.
speaks to that idea of strategic autonomy, being willing to chart your own course when necessary.
And it kind of reinforces the idea that a strong, independent Denmark actually strengthens the EU as a whole.
Yeah. I think so. Because they're bringing new ideas to the table, they can act as a catalyst for progress on issues that might otherwise be stalled.
So by being willing to stand apart, they actually contribute more to the collective good.
It's kind of a paradox, but it seems to be working for them.
It's a fascinating lesson, and it's something that other small countries might want to take note of.
Definitely, in a world that's becoming increasingly complex and interconnected, you can't just sit back and follow the lead of the bigger powers.
You have to find your own voice, leverage your own strengths, and be willing to take a stand, even if it means going it alone sometimes.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
This has been a really interesting deep dive. We've covered so much ground.
We have, from the evolution of Danish diplomacy to the intricacies of their approach to these really complex challenges.
Like China, exactly. And we've explored this idea of boiler suit diplomacy, how they balance multilateralism with this idea of strategic autonomy.
And hopefully uncovered some valuable lessons for other small countries that are trying to find their way in the world.
That's the goal. And I think the biggest takeaway for me is that, in international relations, size isn't everything.
It's about being smart, being strategic.
It's about building strong partnerships and having the courage to lead, even when things are uncertain.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back soon with another deep dive into the world of diplomacy.